the farmers who have provided important support for Trump are going to lose their market. They're going to lose the China market, which is the biggest market. It's going to really hurt Mr. Trump politically, and that's what he understands. So even from the outset, my own view has been that these tariffs are really not about the tariffs themselves. It's basically a reminder to the rest of the world that America is number one. America remains boss. Just in case you're beginning to wonder what's happening with America, America is boss. It's almost like a gangster type of logic. It's an assertion.
Welcome to Global Majority for Peace podcast. I'm Ileana Chan. Every week on this podcast, we discuss with special guests from across the world our mission of building a global movement to challenge the US-led war drive against China, Russia, and countries in the global south. So please subscribe, comment, share our videos, and we do encourage people to become members of Patreon on our Patreon /Empire Watch. So please do that. We'll put like the first 30 minutes of the interview here on YouTube and then the full episode on Patreon. And the full episode is also available as an audio on Spotify and Amazon Music every Saturday. Today we are very excited. Well, I am very excited to welcome Jomo Kwame Sundaram. Did I say your name?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay.
That's fine. It's actually not my name. It's my father's name.
Okay, sorry. So double sorry. Jomo is currently research advisor at Khazanah Research Institute in Kuala Lumpur. He was an economics professor at the University of Malaya and founding chair of IDEAS, a heterodox international development economics network based in and led from the global south. He previously served in senior roles in the United Nations, including Assistant Secretary General for Economic Development and Assistant Director General at the Food and Agriculture Organization, contributing to global economic and social development initiatives. Wow, that was a mouthful. Sorry about not being able to get through that, but you're incredibly, you have incredible achievements here. Thank you so much for coming on Global Majority for Peace Pod. And we like to begin with kind of like a personal sort of question to sort of ease us into the conversation. So could you start with the origin of your politicization? Was there a particular incident that has led you to where you are now, etc.?
Thank you very much, Ileana, for having me here tonight. I have had the privilege of being given two African names, and that had consequences. So from a very early age, I was very aware of the significance of those two names. I was going to be named Kwame after Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana, but more importantly, the founding secretary of the Pan-Africanist Congress, which was a very important movement involving not only Africans in the diaspora, but also Africans in the Americas, especially in the Caribbean, but also in both North and South America, which will form the origins of the Pan-Africanist movement. My father was invited to join the Victory Parade after World War II, and while waiting around for the Victory Parade to start, because it was postponed due to the severe winter of 1945, he attended the Pan-Africanist Congress in Manchester and then the subsequent one in London, because he was waiting in London for quite a while. And there he saw Nkrumah at work. But by the time I was born at the end of 1952, Jomo Kenyatta had been arrested, subsequently jailed, and finally came out from jail in 1959. I was too young to be aware of it at that time, but a few years later, at the end of 1963, coincidentally on my birthday, my 11th birthday, Kenya got its independence. So I was very aware of the struggles for independence from that very early age, and I also continued to have that interest. My father had traveled quite a bit as part of the sort of ex-servicemen or veterans movement in those days, and he often brought home publications which I devoured. As an only child, I didn't have very much to entertain me. We didn't own a television set, and we had a shortwave radio, which I enjoyed listening to. So I often listened to shortwave radio from different parts of the world, including all kinds of unusual places. I would get material, for example, through my father from Hanoi. The Hanoi Courier was regularly sent to our home and so on. So by the time I went to upper secondary school at the age of 14, I was already reasonably aware. 1967 was the year I started upper secondary school. That was the year Che Guevara was killed in Bolivia. And early the following year, around the time of what we might be termed the Lunar New Year, was the famous Tet Offensive, which reversed the situation of the Vietnam War very, very significantly. And of course, 1968 was also the year when both Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy were killed. And there was the beginnings of the peace movement, or the growth of the peace movement, on the back of the civil rights movement in North America. Even in my school, the annual school play was inspired by various things such as the civil rights movement in the US and attempt to try to deal with one particular manifestation of what is referred to as imperialism in the form of what was happening with the Vietnam War. And then the students at the University of Malaya, while I was still in school, traveled around the country trying to raise consciousness about issues at the time of the 1969 elections. So at that very early stage, I was very privileged to be in a boarding school where I would mix with people from all over the country, perhaps not so much Sabah and Sarawak in those days, but certainly from the rest of the country, and had an incredible opportunity of realizing the diversity of this country and the complexities and challenges. But also, I was in charge of subscribing to magazines for the whole, what is called a company. And that also gave me the privilege of having to read some of these magazines and becoming quite aware of what was going on in the world.
Thank you. Yeah, that's an interesting start. But moving on to more current events, could you help us unpack some of the developing news that we're receiving? It seems like we're getting whiplash here. Trump's infamous Liberation Day, with every country was hit with a tariff, the lowest being at 10%, and the highest was Cambodia with 49%. Like, putting aside China, which we'll ask about in a follow-up question, Malaysia was somewhere in the middle with a 24% tariff. Of course, everything is apparently frozen now for 90 days. This is obviously creating a lot of volatility. Could you break down for us what you foresee the implications are?
I have been getting a lot of flack over remarks I've made about the Trump tariffs. I don't really have a very strong view about the tariffs. As an economist, I do not believe that it is likely that he will be able to achieve his major goals, partly because he's surrounded by economists who are trying to provide some rationale, and they are unable to provide any advice, so to speak, to him. They're just trying to rationalize what he's trying to do. And some of the attempts to do so are quite heroic, if I can put it that way, but they are not very convincing in my view. But I think there is a real danger that many of the critics are falling into the trap of embracing the old neoliberal narrative, of accepting the view that globalization or opening up economies to free trade would lift all boats. And this was a myth. And it was a myth which had become very evident in developed countries, but especially in the United States, because the United States deindustrialization was accelerated by that. Now, the reason why I feel that Trump is unlikely to succeed is because he is using tariffs to try to turn the clock back, to go back to a certain manufacturing or industrial capacities which have largely been lost. They've been lost for two reasons. One, it is true that cheaper imports from the rest of the world, where workers are paid very low, much lower wages, are responsible for competing with the American workers who are much more highly paid and hence couldn't sustain that kind of competition. But there was another reason which has become extremely important in recent decades, and that is increasing automation and mechanization. And this automation and mechanization means that you cannot just simply turn back the clock and go back to the old manufacturing activities. You really need to go forward, But going forward involves rediscovering things which have largely been lost. So one would have thought that a useful starting point for Mr. Trump is actually to sort of selectively elaborate some of the policies introduced by Biden's so-called Inflation Reduction Act, and particularly some of the so-called industrial policy elaborated by his national security advisor by the name of Jake Sullivan. But, the nature of American politics, and Mr. Trump is perhaps an extreme embodiment of this, is to rubbish everything which the other rival parties have done. So there's very little continuity in policy. And this is where the toxic politics which you have in the United States actually undermines any kind of policy continuity. Policy continuity is important for credibility. Regimes cannot change every 4 years, for example. You need some degree of continuity. And this is where Mr. Trump's undermining of international law, particularly the law, international law in the World Trade Organization and so on, will come back to bite America, because now it has become very, very clear for anybody who had any doubts about it that Mr. Trump has very little regard for the rule of law. He will only use the rule of law when it serves his ends, his purposes. Otherwise, he has very little regard, because what the tariffs he has announced completely undermine what was carefully negotiated during the 1980s and early 1990s and culminated in the World Trade Organization. To be sure, I'm a critic of the World Trade Organization and many of its provisions. And I suspect Mr. Trump will use the World Trade Organization, for example, to strengthen what are called intellectual property rights, copyright, patents, and so on and so forth, because these are very important to the major forms of profit making for the American elite today. There's a man who's very close to Mr. Trump, one of the founders of PayPal, a man by the name of Peter Thiel. And Thiel basically makes a very straightforward argument. According to him, competition is for losers. In other words, he's not interested in ensuring competition, which a lot of neoliberal and other liberal economists talk about. He's not interested in that, and he's made it very, very clear. But even others who are of sort of more liberal ilk, so to speak, have been talking since the last century, for about more than 40 years, if I'm not mistaken, about things like competitive advantage. And competitive advantage is basically trying to capture the privileges associated with monopoly. And when you have an intellectual property right, you basically have a monopoly over the use of a particular new item of knowledge. Now, this has basically frustrated many developing countries from being able to industrialize, to develop their manufacturing and develop otherwise, precisely because it has become much, much more expensive to acquire knowledge, to acquire the rights, and to use certain kinds of techniques and so on and so forth. But this is a major problem of a major cause of underdevelopment. So the system today, which has been protecting intellectual property rights for the last 3 decades since 1995, is something which has strengthened these monopolies in the West. And these people who are the basis of the so-called billionaire class, which is highly supportive of President Trump. So President Trump has a cabinet with about at least a dozen or so people who are billionaires, and they have made no bones about the fact that they expect to make back what they have invested in supporting President Trump in his second election, but even before that, and in many ways ongoing. So this reminds us about how corrupt, in a sense, American politics has become, American democracy has become, American elections have become, and we have basically a system, a political system, the best political system money can buy. And that's what you have not only in America, but increasingly in much of the world. So this is a major challenge. But the point really to emphasize here is that President Trump has demonstrated his brazen disregard for contempt of the rule of law and contempt of multilateralism as well, a system where you begin to engage with other countries and you begin to look for so-called win-win solutions. You don't presume that everything is what people call a zero-sum game. That if, for example, you and I were to cooperate, the only way I can do well is at your expense, rather than looking at cooperative outcomes which would be mutually beneficial.
I mean, certainly the US has been doing a zero-sum game for a long time now, but Trump's, I think, handling of situations tends to be a lot more blatant, a lot more lacking in finesse. He doesn't even bother seemingly to cover what he's doing. What is the significance of the tariffs? Like, is he really on other countries? Is he overplayed his hand here? Like, do you think there's a significance to outside of China, for example, countries in Africa or like other countries? Like, obviously, Mexico, Canada, those are huge trading partners. They're going to be affected. But what about other countries that might not have as huge a chunk of trade with the US? How are they going to weather this?
Well, it's very difficult to generalize about the rest of the world because we're talking about almost 200 countries. But I think what has happened very interestingly over the last few days is China has said enough is enough because they basically have estimated that the tariffs are so high now, there's very little which is going to be exported and which the tariffs will allow to be imported into the US. So to hell with it all. That's the basic Chinese attitude. So the Chinese, interestingly, imposed what they call reciprocal tariffs. So Trump claims that the tariffs are reciprocal, but in fact, there's no evidence that they are reciprocal. And the Chinese have responded by introducing reciprocal tariffs because the rationale is that they compensate for what the US has imposed upon them. And Trump, of course, had tried to deter others from doing so by imposing even higher tariffs. But what China has done is especially interesting in that it has basically given up the possibility of exporting. So once you do that, once you have given up the option of exporting to the US, it allows them to actually impose even higher tariffs if they want to, and they probably will. But most importantly, they've also shifted the whole discussion. So one of the major export of the US to China over recent decades has actually been food, agricultural exports. This is going to mean that now the tariffs is not going to be just about manufacturers. It's going to be about agriculture as well. And the farmers of the United States who have relied on the Chinese market. I mean, take, for example, something like chicken. Almost all the chicken feet in the US are exported to China. China is the only market for chicken feet. Now, the Americans like to eat breast meat to make things like chicken nuggets and things like that. So almost every other part of the chicken has to be sold through using various gimmicks and so on. So you have things like buffalo wings, the chili wings, and I'm not a chicken fan, so I don't know all the names of the different gimmicks, but these are means by which the entire chicken can be sold. And most of the rest of the chicken is sold abroad. Only the chicken breasts are preserved in the US. Likewise with the legs, although there's much more greater demand for the so-called drumstick within the US itself. So you can see that the farmers who have provided important support for Trump are going to lose their market. They're going to lose the China market, which is the biggest market. It's going to really hurt Mr. Trump politically, and that's what he understands. So even from the outset, my own view has been that these tariffs are really not about the tariffs themselves. It's basically a reminder to the rest of the world that America is number one. America remains boss. Just in case you're beginning to wonder what's happening with America, America is boss. It's almost like a gangster type of logic. It's an assertion. And, I'm not at all surprised about the 90-day pause and so on and so forth. It's likely to be even more. And Mr. Trump will not be disappointed. You see, trade law is supposed to be made by Congress. It's not supposed to be made by the president. So if Congress, even though it's Republican dominated, insists on keeping the prerogative to make trade law, it is quite possible that they're going to amend the tariff proposals so much so that there'll be very little left of the current proposals. And there are any number of jokes about what is happening now. Everybody has heard about the penguins, the penguin island, which has got zero exports, so on and so forth. But Leo Tolstoy, the Russian writer, the 19th century writer, once said that everybody is happy together, but when families are miserable, they're miserable separately. And this is what has happened with the tariffs. Every country is unhappy, but they're all unhappy in their own different way because of the very different nature of the economies and how the tariffs will impact them and so on and so forth. So the result is that it's very difficult to envisage any unified action in response, except for what China has done. But Mr. Trump and his advisors would be making a serious mistake if they mistake this. Hannibal Lecter had this series of films, and the first one was called The Silence of the Lambs. And it refers to the fact that very often before they are slaughtered, the lambs suddenly go quiet. So, the fact that countries are all not saying anything critical of the United States after they saw what happened to Canada and Mexico and China, nobody is saying very much. And Mr. Trump has made no bones about it. Last week, for example, he said, everybody is coming to see me to kiss my ass. I mean, he's completely cynical about his relationship with the rest of the world. Now, all these poor ministers who have been doing this ass kissing, to use Trump's language, none of them are going to feel any great love for the Americans for this. So, what Trump is unwittingly doing is isolating the US from the rest of the world, but also creating a great deal of resentment of a new type of assertion of American dominance. But I think the other point to note is there's an economist named Stephen Miran, and there's no particular reason why most people should pay attention to him. But if one wants to understand the so-called economic rationale or justification for Trump's actions, he attempts to do so. I don't agree with him, but otherwise it's very dangerous for all of us to just dismiss him as mad, as crazy, and so on and so forth, because there is a certain method to his madness. It doesn't mean it's correct, but there is a method to his apparent madness. And perhaps more importantly, there is a larger game plan. So I will not be surprised, for example, if he gives yet another tax break, which he has promised, and ostensibly to compensate for the tariffs, for the burden of the tariffs, because tariffs are going to raise prices, and he will provide a tax break for that purpose. So all this is going to have fairly significant consequences in terms of his credibility, of how he's perceived, not only by the rest of the world, but also by the American public. The problem is that we have, I refer to him as the Orange Emperor. The Orange Emperor has no clothes, but nobody dares to tell him.
But do you think these tax breaks will be for his cronies or will it be for the wider population?
No. I mean, let's face it. The last time he did it, he gave the larger population, the so-called American middle class, a small tax break. But it was enough to keep them really happy and to make sure that, for example, Biden didn't try to reverse it. Even though Biden inherited this fiscal problem of not having much tax revenue, he couldn't do anything because of the popularity of these tax breaks. Who wants to pay taxes if they can help it, right? Taxes are among the most unpopular thing. So it's a very popular thing to remove taxes, but you can always do it in such a way that the tax breaks for your cronies are well hidden, whereas you basically give enough to the hoi polloi, to the ordinary person to keep them pretty happy. I don't think the poorest people in the United States, for example, are going to benefit much from the tax breaks. It's not going to offset the effect of the tariffs. But certainly, I think what is often referred to as the middle class is likely to get something. Maybe not enough this time, but certainly they will get something. I mean, that's what politicians always do.
Right. Something to sort of appease the masses while he continues widening the wealth gap. One of the things that China has been sort of offering the world in the past maybe decade or so is an alternative to the US hegemony in small ways, like in hopeful ways that we might be reaching some sort of multipolarity. And one of the initiatives has been the Belt and Road Initiative. Of course, that's been accused, one of the propaganda points against China is that the Belt and Road Initiative is debt trade diplomacy. The irony of that is, of course, that the IMF and the World Bank, and you definitely know a lot about the IMF and the World Bank, have for decades been systemic tools for US economic hegemony, undermining sovereignty and economic stability around the world. Can you help us unpack the realities of these different initiatives and provide some real life examples of how the IMF and the World Bank consistently convince countries to adopt policies against their own interests?
Ileana, you just asked me a huge
I
question,
know.
which covers so many different important issues. I think it's important to recognize that the system, which was created in 1944 at Bretton Woods, was a flawed system. Although I have a great deal of respect for Keynes, for example, the most influential economist of the 20th century, nonetheless, the system was flawed. Perhaps not entirely of his own doing, because it was the Americans who were calling the shots in 1944. But basically, the system in Bretton Woods did not ensure that there was nothing to deter countries from having a huge trade surplus. And that's precisely the source of the problems. Countries which were basically devastated after World War II, such as Germany and Japan, who were deterred from having military spending because they were seen as responsible for World War II, they were encouraged to catch up, to grow, to keep them in the camp of the so-called free world, the American-led free world, against the Soviet Union and its allies. So this was the world which was created. And so the development of the system was basically favorable to this so-called free world. But what also happened was that it privileged the Americans. And there was growing resentment, especially from Europe. And in the 1960s, for example, the French president, Charles de Gaulle, and his finance minister, who later became president, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, they referred to the position of the US under the Bretton Woods system as giving them an exorbitant privilege. And what this basically meant was that the US could borrow indefinitely from the rest of the world without having to pay back, precisely because the rest of the world was running a trade surplus and the US was running a permanent trade deficit. Now, the permanent trade deficit did not come about immediately. It began to grow during the 1960s. But what happened was immediately after World War II, the only place where the industrial capacities had grown during World War II was the US. And because the US is on a continent which is so far away from Europe or Japan, remember that when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, they never reached the continent, the North American continent. They only attacked the Hawaiian Islands. So the geography protected the US to a great extent. So the US came through the World War II unscathed. And because of full employment during World War II, when women, for example, were employed in higher numbers than ever before and ever since, we find that there was a certain kind of equality which came about during this period. But the point to be made here is that this was a time when the US was providing a huge surplus and on fairly generous terms to protect the future of American hegemony. So you find, for example, that the US was producing a great deal which it get exported to the rest of the world on fairly generous terms, but not only to rebuild Europe under what was called the Marshall Plan, but also to Northeast Asia, for example, to Japan, because the Soviet troops were very close to Japan when the bomb was dropped. I mean, part of the reason for the Americans dropping the bomb was to seize the advantage from the Soviet Union, because it was the Soviets who defeated the Nazis in Europe. So this was an attempt to try to seize the advantage again. So they did that quite successfully. But by the 1960s, industrial capacities were beginning to be rebuilt, not only in Germany and Japan, but also in the rest of Europe, which had been bombed out. I mentioned earlier that my father had been to London right after the war for the Victory Parade, which had to be postponed because of the devastation left by Hitler and Werner von Braun's rockets during World War II. So all this basically meant that during the 1960s, when Kennedy became president, he was persuaded to slowly open up the US economy. The US economy was very protectionist up to then, but he began to open up quite a bit. And that opening up slowly opened up. And so the US economy began to export a great deal. And because of the role of the military during World War II, especially, and after World War II, many people might remember that there was a president during the 1950s by the name of Eisenhower, who had been a general during World War II. He was the leading general in Europe. So Eisenhower basically warned at the end of his presidency of the growing power of what was called the military-industrial complex. And this military-industrial complex has continued to become much more influential, contrary to what Eisenhower had warned. But the key point to remember is that this influence and power of the military-industrial complex basically meant two things. One, that they continued to grow in influence, not only in corporate terms, but also in terms of government policy. And a great deal of research was undertaken by the military-industrial complex. And because much of the research undertaken by the military-industrial complex were for dual purpose or multi-purpose ends, so we have had, for example, many benefits from that. For example, MRIs, which people have, or CAT scans, or the birth of the internet, and a whole range of things were actually from military-sponsored research. And some of the other research, for example, for diseases and so on, were done supported by the government. So rather than recognize how important government spending and government sponsorship of such research, what we find is that since Reagan, but especially with Trump, he does not appreciate this role of government. So they've thrown the baby out with the bathwater. So the bathwater is the so-called deep state, the swamp, and all the other rhetoric which comes out of the Trump camp. And much of it, of course, has some basis. But precisely because of that, and giving the free hand to people like Mr. Musk and his minions, we have seen now the devastation and the hollowing out of government capacities in the US. So what has been the basis for American success and technological progress is now being undermined by the state itself. And this is going to be a huge problem. So what we find is that the role of the IMF was to maintain this system, which was created in 1944 and implemented a few years after the war. And basically, a crucial part of that system was supposed to be international trade. And there was a very important meeting held in Cuba, in Havana at that time, and they came up with the Havana Charter. But the proposal to liberalize trade in the 1940s was not acceptable to the US Congress. So the US Congress rejected it, but it was later in the early 1960s that under the Kennedy administration that this opening up of trade began. And it was very, very fast. And within a few years, American transnational companies became very dominant worldwide. And this, of course, opened up a new stage and gave rise to something which many people refer to as globalization. So the role of the IMF was basically as an enabler. But when it came to the rest of the world, especially developing countries, it has also been an economic policeman. And most importantly, it has controlled access to credit and especially emergency credit. So anytime countries get into trouble, often due to no fault of their own, once they get into trouble and they go to the IMF seeking emergency credit, the IMF does so, provides emergency credit, but always with conditionalities. Often the conditionalities have nothing to do with the source of the problem, the reason why the country had to go to the IMF, but rather it has to do with the dictates which of the most powerful countries in the world, both European as well as North American, who dominate the IMF. So the IMF is really the crucial institution. The World Bank was created also in 1944 at the Bretton Woods Conference, and the World Bank is supposed to provide credit. The original name of the bank was for reconstruction and development. So the reconstruction of the countries of the North after World War II because of the devastation of World War II. So mainly Europe, but also other parts of the world which were devastated by World War II. So reconstruction refers to that. But that period is largely over. It's been over for quite some time. So the main role the World Bank plays is with regards to the rest of the world. But there are many problems with the World Bank, and it's very difficult to summarize all of them. but the World Bank was for many years the leading source of credit. Again, when providing credit, the World Bank would introduce what are called conditionalities. And especially following the collapse of the international monetary system from the early 1980s due to raising higher interest rates imposed by a man called Paul Volcker, who was chairman of the US Federal Reserve. Once that was done, many countries, especially Latin America, but also in Africa, had to go running to get emergency credit. At that time, the only source of so-called concessional emergency credit was the World Bank, but it came at a very heavy price. And the heavy price was in the form of what were called structural adjustment programs, where the World Bank imposed what was sometimes referred to as the Washington Consensus view of what the reforms which should be taking place. So these were called structural adjustment programs, and these structural adjustment programs basically resulted in these countries all becoming much more open economies, but open in a double sense, open to trade on the one hand, but also open to foreign investment. So it basically provided a means for new forms of economic domination by most powerful countries in the world, most of which were in the north, what is now called the global north. They benefited a great deal for it, but it was all obscured by the more subtle relationships of exploitation, which were associated with these new types of relationships. And at an ideological level, this was facilitated by a number of things. So you had much more free trade, much more economic liberalization, much more privatization, the strengthening of property rights, and so on. And in this regard, Mrs. Thatcher, who had come to power from 1979, led the way. Although the UK was a shadow of its former imperial self, she had a very, very profound effect in terms of setting the agenda. Because the US had never had a significant large public sector. It had not had a strong militant trade union movement after the CIO amalgamated with the AFL, the American Federation of Labor in the United States. So the period of labor militancy was largely over in the US, and it never really had a large public sector, unlike the UK, where all this had been achieved, especially in the post-war period, not only during the period when labor was in power, but also very often when the Conservatives were in power. Macmillan, for example, did not try to undo, for example, the National Health Service and a number of other institutions. Council housing, for example, came in during this period. Much of the building of new housing after World War II was enabled by different levels of government in the UK. So the history of the US is quite different. This was made possible by a number of things, but very importantly, the use of war for acquiring political legitimacy also became very important. Mrs. Thatcher would not have been re-elected in 1983 if not for the fact that she had gone to war with Argentina in 1982. And that war gave her a certain credibility. She was doing very, very badly in the polls in 1982 before she went to war. And this happened again in 2003 when George W. Bush went to war with Iraq. Of course, they all knew that there weren't any weapons of mass destruction, but that provided a convenient excuse to go to war. And even though that war was largely won at a high cost of about 4 trillion, according to Joseph Stiglitz, and there's no real justification for that war. That war was a completely illegal war, but nobody has ever been prosecuted. Nobody has been dragged before the International Criminal Court for that war. I mean, that war killed many more people, or for that matter, the Vietnam War, than many of these other things, which the relatively small wars where people are being dragged to the International Criminal Court and so on. Not that these people do not deserve to be convicted and so on, but what I'm trying to point to is that the increasing politicization and weaponization of the rule of law, of multilateral institutions and so on, for the purposes of control, for the purposes of empire.
Thank you for watching the first part of our interview. Please head over to patreon.com/Empire Watch to watch the full episode. The podcast is also available as an audio on Spotify and Amazon Music every Saturday.